Hello students and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture, Preservation, or You're Saving What Now? Here are our weekly topics for this week. What is the difference between preservation and conservation? What steps can archivists take to improve the preservation of their materials? And how have archivists responded to changing notions of preservation? We'll be looking at 4 of our course learning objectives during this lecture: define core concepts and principles, evaluate the role that records creators play in the construction of social memory, looking at the relationship between different aspects of archival practice, and our factors that have influenced the evolution of the archival profession. So we'll start by talking about the goal of preservation. So just take a little bit and think about what the goal or goals of preservation might be. Okay, so essentially the goal of preservation is to prevent unwanted changes, to retain the record and the information that it contains, and as we'll talk about next week with digital preservation, information about the record itself for future access in as authentic a way as possible. So we'll really be focusing on different aspects of preservation and the connection between preservation and authenticity, and then looking at some of the specific ways that archivists can preserve records and other issues that archivists should consider when thinking about the goal of preservation and enacting preservation processes. Okay, we'll start with a definition of preservation. So this is from the SAA Glossary of Archival Records and Terminology. And this describes preservation as the professional discipline of protecting materials by minimizing chemical and physical deterioration, preventing damage, and generally speaking, preservation is thought of as being a non-invasive treatment. And Miller describes it as the passive protection of archival materials. So there's no physical or chemical treatment done. So when you think of something as being non-invasive, it's really hands-off, and you're not sort of actively intervening with the record or with the record's appearance or nature in order to preserve it. So next we'll look at conservation. Actually, to go back and talk a little bit more about preservation. So the Sheffield article mentions on page 576 how Miller also considers access restrictions, inspections, and preservation policies as being under the umbrella of preservation as well. And that preservation may also include active interventions into record-keeping processes. So we'll talk about those a little bit later on. But again, if you have something like an access restriction in order to protect the record, that's pretty non-invasive. You're not actually interacting with the record or doing any kind of physical or chemical treatment to the record. If you're inspecting the record, that may lead to physical or chemical treatment in the form of conservation, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But that's not necessarily the case, or even often the case. And developing preservation policies is also a pretty passive way to protect archival materials. Okay, so getting to conservation. So the SAA Glossary of Archival and Records Terminology describes conservation as being more of a process that does involve chemical or physical treatments. And the idea with conservation is that records survive in their original form as long as possible. So getting back to sort of the goals of preservation and kind of an extension of preservation is conservation as being the record remaining in its original form for as long as possible. And then kind of related to that, there is a whole profession of people who engage in conservation acts. So conservation is something that Laura Miller describes as the active protection of archival material, or the physical act of preservation. So something that is invasive, that is active, and doesn't rely on some of the passive activities that we discussed when we defined preservation just a minute ago. So again, as NARA states, conservation attempts to preserve records in their original format. Okay, so next we will talk about restoration. So this is the process of rehabilitating an item to return it as nearly as possible to its original condition. So Miller describes this as being a process as undertaken when the item is important and there is no danger of altering the authenticity of the original. And she also states that this is not common in archives. So essentially, a restoration takes place when records have degraded or decayed to the point where there needs to be this extensive process of rehabilitating the record, and again attempting to return it to its original form, at least as nearly as possible. And as Miller notes here, authenticity is a big issue when it comes to restoration. So if you do a restoration where the record that you're restoring looks like this and you end up with something that looks like this, again, thinking of the example of the cathedral in Spain where a good-natured woman tried to restore a fresco in a cathedral, and her attempts weren't really up to standards. Obviously, this is an example of restoration that has gone wrong and that really has altered the authenticity of the record, because the record no longer looks anything like it did when it was originally created. So obviously this is a situation that you want to avoid as an archive, or more likely a museum or some other cultural body. So when we talk about preserving things in their original form, or as close to the original form as possible, we are talking about authenticity. So it really is a goal of preservation to preserve records in a condition as close to the original as possible. And records that are preserved in this way are more authentic because there haven't been changes to the appearance of the record that, if they accumulate over time and become significant enough, can make the record quite different from how the record was when it was originally created, when it was originally used by the person or organization that created the record. So in a lot of ways, records that are more authentic are more valuable to researchers because they do give researchers more of a connection to the original look and feel of the record, and especially for researchers that are engaged in pretty significant academic undertakings like writing a thesis or a book or a documentary. They want to look at records that are as authentic as possible. So preservation is meant to encase the records as these insects are encased in amber, and preserve them in their original format as much as possible for as long as is possible. Of course, this level of authenticity is not possible in all circumstances with all records and all archives. And archives may have to make compromises when preserving their records that can negatively impact the authenticity of the records in their care. So there is a connection between the amount of archival intervention in the care of a record and the challenges to the authenticity of a record. So the more archivists intervene, the more they have an active role in preserving records and attempting to keep them as close to their original format as possible, the less likely it is that records are going to change in ways that challenge their authenticity. And again, this assumes that these interventions don't challenge the authenticity of the record themselves, so that records aren't conserved or restored in a way that significantly alters the appearance of the record and makes it no longer resemble how the record was when it was originally created. So some of these types of interventions might include collection surveys, so looking at collections to see if there are any preservation issues that are present in the collection, so records that may be molding or decaying or particularly fragile. Another archival intervention, which we'll touch on later, is archivists working with donors prior to the donation of records to make sure that the records are being cared for before they are sent to an archive. And that can be a big one. And it could be something as straightforward as just placing materials in climate-controlled areas. So these interventions don't necessarily have to be significant, but the more of them that occur, the more likely it is that archivists are going to be aware of preservation challenges that can undermine the authenticity of a record, and the more capable they will be of addressing those preservation concerns and challenges before it gets to the point where the records have really decayed or their appearance has been altered, and they may appear now quite different from how they appeared when the record was created, and thus be less authentic. So next we'll talk about what I like to call my hierarchy of preservation. So at the bottom, we have just general non-invasive passive preservation. And so this is a fairly uninvolved form of preservation, so represented by the amoeba here. You generally just put things on a climate-controlled shelf, or maybe not even a climate-controlled shelf, and say, okay, we're fairly confident that these are going to remain accessible and reasonably authentic over time, and that's good enough for us. Above and beyond that, you have conservation, represented by the crying toddler here. So much more evolved. As we mentioned before, it does involve an active intervention in the records through physical or chemical treatments to keep them in a form that is close to the original form of the record as possible. So this might mean working to repair rips in a document. It might mean rebinding books, or there's a whole list of conservation treatments that might be used by archivists. And then at the very pinnacle, the very tip, we have restoration, represented by quite possibly the pinnacle of humanity, Aaron Rodgers, quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. So this is a very evolved type of preservation, or extension of preservation, in which records have degraded for whatever reason, and archivists, or more likely people at museums, go back and try and restore the records to their original form. So again, very expensive, very resource intensive, and very unlikely to occur within archives, or even occur to most records that exist out there, simply because of the resources that are involved with restoration. So conservation still takes some resources. You have to have expertise and supplies, but the difference in resources required between conservation and restoration are still quite significant. And restoration is much more involved, and thus less likely to be done to records. So it's important to note that preservation is largely a collections-based process. So it's something that you're going to do to an entire collection. You're going to put an entire collection on a shelf. You're going to survey an entire collection. Whereas conservation and restoration are much more items-based. You're probably not going to conserve an entire collection because that would be very expensive and time-consuming. You're probably not going to restore an entire collection. You may restore or conserve an item or two, but it's not something that is going to be broadly applied. A part of that is because due to the resource-intensive nature of conservation and restoration is just not economically feasible, and also there may not be an entire collection of records that is really important enough or worthy of conservation attention, let alone restoration attention. So next we'll talk about some preservation basics, and this is something that the Laura Miller chapter for this week touches on. So first of all, you want to keep your records cool, like the fawns. You want to have them in a nice temperature range between 64 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. You also want to keep your records fairly dry, so an humidity between 35 and 50%. And this is going to prevent your records from getting damp and possibly increasing the likelihood that they're going to expand, which can damage the records, and also records that are moist are more hospitable to mold, which is certainly a preservation issue because it eats paper. You also want to keep your records in the dark as much as possible. So as the Miller chapter notes, light causes chemical reactions and decay, so those chemical reactions can eat away at the paper and in turn cause the paper to degrade. Another preservation basic is physical security, so security from theft, security from abuse. So obviously you want to be there in the reading room and you want to have your records being observed either by a person or by cameras, so that if someone starts tearing up your records, then you can stop them, or if someone tries to take records from your repository, then you'll be available to stop that as well. Autograph hunting used to be a big thing, and so people would go into archives and razor blade out autographs on records from famous people, and so that is an issue the archives had to deal with. And obviously if you razor blade someone's autograph out of a record, that obviously alters the record in a way that challenges its authenticity. Another thing to consider is protecting your records from polluted air, which can be abrasive and acidic, so that can damage records. You want to make sure that you are aware of pests and preventing pests from infesting your records. So it could be mold, it could be insects, it could be rats. I remember hearing of an archive, I think in Morocco, that had like a family of weasels living in their stacks. So obviously not a good situation for the health of your records. Another big concern is fire. You want to have some kind of fire prevention system that will stop your records from burning up, which can obviously impact their accessibility and authenticity. And you also want to be aware of the acidity of your records. So as the Miller chapter notes, acidic paper will decay faster, and that can cause your records to degrade over time as well. So an important thing to consider is stability, especially when it comes to temperature and humidity. If your records are in conditions that aren't perfect, but those conditions are stable, then that's better than your records being in conditions that fluctuate over time, because if records expand and contract due to, say, the amount of moisture in the air, then that can damage the records. So even if you can't have your records in these perfect conditions where they are in the temperature range and they're protected from polluted air and things like that, if you can keep your conditions stable, then that's an important part of the battle. So of course it's important to note that not every archive can maintain these conditions throughout their stacks. So climate control in stacks can be expensive, and not every archive is capable of having all or even a part of their collections in climate controlled conditions. So not every archive is able to meet these preservation basics with every single record in the repository. So one part of preservation that we talked about before was the need to develop a preservation plan, or including a preservation plan as a part of your preservation efforts. And so this is something that the Miller chapter for this week talks about as well. So we'll talk about some different aspects of a preservation plan. So first of all, conducting a preservation survey, going through your collections and identifying any possible preservation issues that you have going on. So, okay, we went through this box and we saw that there was some mold, or it looks like there are some insects or maybe some rats in the stack. So let's address that so that these records aren't damaged any further. Once you have information about your collections from your preservation survey, you would then identify preservation priorities. So which of the issues that you have identified are going to be the ones that you're really going to work on addressing? What are you going to prioritize as an archive with the resources that you have to devote to preservation? Another thing that can be included in a preservation plan are guidelines for the storage and handling of materials. So saying, this type of material needs to be held in this particular room because this room has conditions that really support this type of record. These records are going to be handled in a particular way. So one example that I can think of is at the American Heritage Center, they have some nitrate film, and nitrate film is very combustible, and if it's not preserved in a satisfactory manner, then it can burst into flames. So the HC had a policy where if someone wanted to access these nitrate images, the images on nitrate film, then they had to give 24 hours notice. The records had to be placed, the records were stored in a freezer, and when someone wanted to look at them, they were placed in slightly warmer conditions to kind of acclimatize the records. And then once they were in those conditions for a certain amount of time, a researcher could look at them. So really specific details about how to store and handle those materials because of their combustible nature. I think they're actually considered hazardous materials. So. And finally, you want to place your preservation plan in the larger context of how your archive operates. So if people did make reference requests for nitrate film, then you knew how to address that and what kind of handling would be related to providing those types of records to researchers. Obviously, nitrate film is a pretty extreme example, and other records may not necessarily have as much of a need for specific storage and handling guidelines, but you may not know that until you find out what's actually in your collections and think about the steps that you need to preserve those materials. Okay, so some of the priorities of a preservation plan include establishing a regular environmental monitoring program, so knowing what conditions your records are living in and being able to compare one day to the next to make sure that you don't have fluctuations and that your records are in a nice, stable, friendly environment. Implementing and maintaining an emergency response plan, which is something that we'll talk about more in just a little bit. Storing materials appropriately, so making sure the materials are stored appropriately and in a good environment for them. Maintaining regular housekeeping, you want to make sure that you have custodial staff that are going through and making sure that your records aren't in rooms that maybe have like crumbs or other things that may attract pests. And identifying and treating high-risk materials. So this is something that you would do during your preservation survey and when identifying preservation priorities. So when you think about conducting a preservation survey and also identifying preservation priorities, you have to think about the connection between preservation and value judgments. So an archive may not be able to survey all of their collections or even, all of one collection. So they may prioritize surveying particular collections or particular parts of collections over others. They may identify preservation issues going on in one collection as being more of a priority than preservation issues that are going on in another collection. So I have some mold going on in collection A, and I also have some mold going on in collection B. Which one am I going to address first? I'm going to address collection B because for whatever reason I think this collection is more important, or these records within collection B are more important, so I'm going to make sure that we take care of these, and I'll save these other records that I don't value as much until later on. So all of these priorities and steps regarding a preservation plan really need to be done in context with an archive's resources. So if an archive doesn't have the resources to conduct a preservation survey of every record in every collection, then it does need to be kind of choosy about which collections it looks at. If an archive is only capable of prioritizing the preservation of some of the preservation issues that it finds, then that's a discussion that needs to be held as well. If an archive doesn't really have the resources to maintain regular housekeeping, then they may not be able to do that. So archives are never the best funded or supported institutions. So you have to think about issues of sustainability when you are developing and implementing these preservation plans. So one aspect of a preservation plan was emergency planning, and as the Miller chapter for this week notes, emergency planning is vital to preservation. It's one of the most important things that an archives can do in order to make sure that records are accessible in the future, and ideally accessible in the most authentic format possible. So emergency plannings should cover all foreseeable hazards. If you are an archive in, say, California, you should probably have something in your emergency plans that addresses what happens if there's a wildfire nearby or an earthquake. If you are an archive in Oklahoma, you may want to have something in your preservation plan that addresses tornadoes. If you are an archive in Green Bay, maybe you want to have something in place that is going to be relevant to what might happen if the Packers win the Super Bowl and people are celebrating and maybe getting a little wild. So just knowing where your archive is and the likely emergencies that your archive is going to face is really something that should be included in your emergency planning. The good thing about emergency planning is it can reduce the amount of time between some kind of emergency taking place and when your archive is able to respond to emergency situations. So if you have guidelines written down about what to do in case X occurs, then that can really reduce the amount of running around and flailing that you do before you're actually addressing the emergency and protecting or saving your records in a way that is going to benefit them. Emergency planning should include training staff in how to respond to different situations. So being aware of the location of supplies and how to use them, being aware of outside vendors or resources to contact, so maybe experts in preserving a particular type of record or experts in responding to water damage. Having staff that are able to respond to a variety of emergencies. So it's good to have an idea of which ones are more likely to occur, but you want to have people that are capable of responding to, you know, a whole variety of emergencies. Maybe the power goes out and the freezer that your nitrate film is in. So what are you going to do there? So it's just good to be prepared for a variety of different possibilities. So again, this is something that the Miller chapter for this week notes. It's also interesting to think of how emergency planning can reflect value judgments by an archive. So maybe your emergency plan says if something happens, if there's a threat to the whole archive, you know, save these collections first. And that really does suggest that an archive values collection A over collection B for whatever reason. So, you know, if there is water damage, we want to respond to water damage to these particular collections first, and we'll worry about the others kind of later on, and we're not as concerned if they are damaged. If there's a fire, you know, which collections are we really going to try and protect above others? So you might think of preservation as being sort of an objective process or activity that archives engage in, but as we've discussed already, there are a couple of ways where value judgments may assert themselves. And if these value judgments are based on subjective reasoning and not objective reasoning, which I, being a cynic, tend to think would be more likely, then these value judgments can really have a strong impact in the preservation activities of an archival repository. So having talked about preservation and some of the different aspects of preservation, I want to connect preservation to MPLP. So more product, less process, which we discussed in our arrangement and description lecture. So as I hinted at during our arrangement and description lecture, in some ways, well, in a lot of ways, preservation and MPLP are at odds to each other. And this is something that the Phillips reading for this week addresses. So Phillips notes that collections must be accessible, which is the purpose of MPLP, but they must also be sustainable. So there must be some kind of preservation care in place that will sustain the records throughout time. So if you just prioritize access and you don't think about protecting and sustaining the records, then you know, that can really long-term undermine the survival and thus accessibility of those records. Phillips also argues that MPLP has a reductivist view about preservation. The MPLP article really focuses on preservation as being a little more than climate control or microconservation, but preservation is more nuanced than the MPLP article discusses. So we've already talked about preservation planning and emergency planning. That's not something that's really mentioned in the MPLP article. And we'll touch on a few things others that really imply that preservation is more complex and sophisticated than Green and Meisner give it credit for. Phillips also questions the notion that addressing preservation during processing reduces processing rates, so that preservation really is a drag and does prevent records from being accessible to researchers more quickly. Philip seems to question whether that's true or not. And the author focuses on the need for item level awareness of preservation concerns in a collection. And that's something that is less likely to occur in MPLP if archivists are just seeking to process records quickly and get them in front of researchers. This item level awareness may not exist. So I have that represented in this diagram here. So the more deeply archivists describe records, the more they're going to interact with those records to learn more about them, to learn about the context and content of the records, and provide that information to researchers. And so the more that archivists are interacting with records, the more likely they are to be aware of preservation issues going on. So if you take a box and you don't really look at the individual records, you just kind of flip through them and say, okay, here's what this box is, and then you move on to the next box, then you're not really interacting with the records all that much. And you may not be aware of, oh, these papers have mold in them, or these photographs are starting to fade and decay. And that's something that we really should address if we want these records to survive and be accessible in the future. So in many ways, MPLPs focus on having a very superficial description of records that doesn't involve much interaction with individual records at all, and that can, as Phillips notes, prevents archivists from being aware of preservation issues that may be going on. And it's important to think of how a preservation issue with one record can impact other records in the box or in the collection. So mold can spread. If film or photographs start to decay, that can release chemical fumes, which can cause records nearby to decay themselves. So, if you miss one thing, then it really can result in damage to some of the surrounding records. So it's not just, oh, I missed this one record, but it's not going to have any greater repercussions. It can, in fact, have repercussions to other records in the collection or records that are stored in the same area as records that have these preservation concerns going on. If archivists aren't interacting with records very deeply, that may also undermine their ability to place an appropriate value on records when they are considering the issue of permanence, which is something that the O'Toole article for this week discusses. And in a lot of ways, this idea of permanence is connected to appraisal. So when a record, as O'Toole notes on pages 11 and 12, singles out a record as being archival and having archival value, they single them out as worthy of permanence. They say, we are going to preserve these records into an indefinite future, until cockroaches rule the world. And as O'Toole notes, this judgment involves a substantial commitment of resources. Even if it's just space on a shelf, that is a resource that archives are singling out and providing to a collection once it's judged as being archival. But O'Toole notes that the meaning of permanence hasn't really been clear in the archival community, and that notions of permanence have shifted over time as records and as the conditions that archives find themselves existing in have changed. So ideas of permanence really boil down to, are you interested in saving the information contained in a record, or are you interested in containing the information and the original format? So either you're interested in containing not just the words that are written on the record, but you really want to preserve the actual paper that the record is written on, the original format that the record was recorded in, or you're just concerned with the letters. You don't really care about the paper that the record is, or that the information is inscribed on. You just want the facts. And obviously, preserving records in their original format, or as close to the original format as possible, does result in a more authentic representation of the record. And again, for some researchers, this might be quite important. They may need to, feel the paper that a record was written on to get some contextual knowledge about it, or they may want to see what the ink on a letter looks like. So this authenticity may be quite important for researchers that really need deep contextual knowledge of a record. But of course, maintaining a record in its original format can be difficult to do over time. So you may need to engage in acts like conservation or even restoration to make this a possibility, because inevitably, even in perfect conditions, records decay. And eventually it's going to get to a point where there does need to be some kind of conservation or restoration work done to a record in order to preserve it in its original format. This is especially true of audiovisual records, which tend to be more fragile. So film can decay over time, especially if it's not kept in good conditions, and it can be expensive to reverse that or even stop that from happening. Focusing on preserving the information of a record results in a record that is less authentic. So this may lead to changes in the record that do undermine the record's authenticity. This is especially true if the format of the record is changed. So if you take something that was in one format and you copy the information contained in the record onto another format. So again, if you take a film that was recorded on a particular type of film and you migrate that content to another part of film, which is easier for archivists to work with, then that's going to affect the authenticity of the record. If you digitize a record, that can change different characteristics of the record as well. So while preserving the information still provides the informational content of the record, it does result in some loss of authenticity. And the choice between preserving a record in its original format or focusing on preserving the information of record oftentimes is a pragmatic one. So as I've implied, doing this is ultimately going to be a lot more expensive in time and resource consuming than just focusing on preserving the information and not providing researchers with the most authentic representation of a record as might be possible. So an archive may not have the resources to do this, they may not have the expertise to do this, and so they just have to settle with focusing on preserving the information. And if the original format that the record is on decays over time, then that's just something that they and their researchers are going to have to deal with. These different notions of permanence have changed over time, as I noted earlier, because of the conditions that archives and archivists found themselves in. So earlier on, as O'Toole notes, around the time of colonial America, there was much more of a focus on preserving the information contained in records. And a lot of focus on making copies of records, and as long as those copies existed, that was fine, even if the actual record itself, the original record, decayed over time. And the reason why copying information and really being happy with just preserving that was such prominent idea of permanence within archives was because of things like this. So fires, natural disasters, other acts that made it much more likely that records were going to be destroyed. So if you think, well, the likelihood of this original record surviving is going to be quite low because things are always burning down or getting flooded or whatever, then let's focus on making a bunch of copies of this record and sort of scattering them to the wind so that even if the archive burns down or the church that the record is in burns down, we still have the information somewhere. What's interesting is there's a particular type of digital preservation today called locks, or locks of copies keeps stuff safe, that incorporates this very idea that if you have your records sort of scattered around in different archives, then that's a good preservation tool. So this is an idea that in some ways has come back in vogue in the archival profession. As time progressed and as technology progressed, technicians developed methods to slow, stop, or even reverse deterioration. So as O'Toole notes, the ravages of time could be controlled, and archives were able to master the science behind preservation. And because of this, there was a preference to preserve copies in their original form. And there really was more of a dissatisfaction with preserving and providing access to copies of records. And as O'Toole notes, the thought was that some records possess unique characteristics that should be preserved, and it was difficult or impossible to preserve these characteristics if researchers were working with copies instead of working with the original that may have the characteristics that archives valued. So again, there really was a rejection of the idea of preserving information through publication. And that idea, which had persisted in the archival profession for some time, really fell out of vogue. As O'Toole notes, permanence became more of a technical term, meaning the permanence of physical archival collections. So again, not the permanence of information, but the permanence of the actual archival collections themselves. So microfilming was a part of this development. So as archivists were able to preserve materials by recording them on microfilm, that was a technology that really became a popular way to preserve records in as authentic a format as possible. And so if you're like me and you've looked at microfilm before, your eyes start to water and hurt over time. It hurts my eyes just a little bit looking at even a picture of microfilm. So I feel bad for all the researchers that kind of had to suffer through the microfilm craze, which still exists with us today. However, as time progressed further, there were some shifts in sensibilities surrounding the idea of permanence and the responsibilities that archivists had to the public and to researchers. And a lot of this was due to the bulk of modern collections and a realization that records were becoming so large, so voluminous, that it was difficult, if not impossible, to preserve every record in its original format. So I talked before about how preserving records in their original format can be very resource intensive, and archivists just couldn't afford to do that for large modern collections. So as O'Toole notes on page 21, this really goes back to the idea of sustainability. Archivists didn't have resources to carry out the goal that they had set for themselves of preserving every record in its original format. So they really had to reevaluate their considerations of what permanence meant and what level of permanence archives should strive for. As O'Toole also notes, this reevaluation of permanence was based on the recognition that the value of a record ebbs and flows over time. So at one point, it may be thought that a record was important enough for preservation in its original format, but maybe in 10 or 20 years, archivists may realize, okay, well, this is no longer true, and we're just kind of wasting our resources providing exhaustive preservation care to records that honestly aren't that important. So this reconsideration of permanence was advocated by Maynard Bridgeford, pictured here, who wrote a preservation manual. And he thought, even though it's a sinful idea, sometimes you just have to let records rot. Sometimes you just have to focus on the informational content within records and not so much preserving them in their original formats. So part of the consideration that an archivist would make when determining whether or not to preserve a record in its original format was this idea of intrinsic value. And interestingly enough, the Huth chapter that we read during our appraisal discussion identified intrinsic value as being a possible appraisal criteria, so connected to appraisal and preservation. So in 1979, the National Archives wrote a report trying to determine exactly what intrinsic value was, because that way, if an archivist saw or felt that a record had intrinsic value, they could justify preserving it in its original format as opposed to focusing on just preserving the informational content of a record. So some of the things that that report mentioned as being possible signs of intrinsic value include the aesthetic value of a record. So if it's a poster that is really beautiful and well done, like this poster from the Department of the Interior about the National Park Service, then that would be something that you would consider, and you would work to, preserve all the beautiful colors and lines and other features of this poster so that it continues to resemble the original as much as possible. Another consideration was exhibit value. So if a record would look really great in an exhibit or would be a great inclusion for an exhibit, that might be another aspect of intrinsic value. If the physical form is an object of study, so maybe wax cylinders that were used to record information in the late 1800s, that would be something that might provide intrinsic value. And much more vaguely, general or public interest because of direct association with famous or historically significant persons or events. So, for instance, if you were looking at, Anne Frank's diary, okay, it may be only a diary, but because of its connection to Anne Frank and her story surrounding living through the Nazi occupation of Holland, that provides this diary with intrinsic value. Or, of course, the Declaration of Independence. We don't really need the informational content of the Declaration of Independence anymore. Everyone knows what it says, or at least enough people know what it says. But because of its importance to America and to American history, that makes it worthy of preservation. So there are some pretty clear examples of records that may have a pretty obvious association with famous or historically significant persons or events. But honestly, this can be a really subjective value judgment to make as well. So what's famous to one person may not be famous or significant to me. So there can be some problems with using this kind of criteria to determine what type of preservation care a collection will or won't receive. So the report stated that only 0.5% of records should receive even conservation treatment. So a very, very small sum of records were thought of as being important enough or of having enough intrinsic value to really receive active intervention on or by archivists in order to preserve the record in its original format. So again, how do you go about thinking what 0.5% of records really are worthy of a level of permanence that focuses on preserving a record in its original format? You know, you can say, okay, well, let's use intrinsic value, but as we've discussed, intrinsic value can be a pretty subjective value judgment or estimation by archivists. So we might look at the overall value of the record. So again, thinking about the content of the record, the context of the record, and using that as a determinant for what level of permanence a record should receive. So, okay, we know that this record documents an important function that this organization carried out, or we know that this record documents an important part of this person's life. So let's focus on providing a higher level of permanence to these records as opposed to other records in our archive or other records even within this person or this organization's records. Another thing to consider is the needs of researchers as much as an archive knows and understands them. So if the people that are typically using an archive have pretty high standards for authenticity when they're using records or considering which records to use, then that may suggest that archives really focus on preserving records in their original format. If the researchers that typically come in are just there for the information, they don't really care about the smell of paper or some other features that may be important to more advanced researchers, then that's something that archives should take into consideration when thinking about either preserving the original format of a record or just focusing on the informational content. And you also have to consider the ability of the archives. Is the archive even capable of preserving records in its original format, or is it really only capable of preserving the informational content of a record? Honestly, most archives are probably only have the resources to worry about the informational content of a record, and again, not employ expensive and resource-intensive acts like conservation or restoration. They just don't have the expertise or the resources to devote to doing that. So all three of these considerations really should be made when an archive is thinking about the permanence of either all of its records or even just a subset of the records in an archive. Is there some subjectivity in here? Yes, of course, especially when you're talking about the value of the record, but I think that you can have a firmer basis for making the decision about the value of a record than you get just by basing it on intrinsic value or even incorporating intrinsic value into the discussion at all. As Sheffield notes on page 576, Hedstrom encourages archivists to consider preservation as an ongoing process. So obviously you just don't put a record in an archive and say, okay, you know, that's that. We preserve the record and we don't have to worry about anything until, you know, the end of the world. So it really is something that requires ongoing concern and awareness and possibly interventions on the behalf of the archivist. So it really is a process that extends into the future and extends into the past as well. Sheffield notes that preservation may include working with donors prior to donation in order to ensure that the preservation of records is taking place before the records are appraised by archivists. So if an archivist is able to identify potential donors and work with them to make sure that records aren't sitting in grandma's basement for, the next 50 years, where they're being, chewed on by rats and the basement floods every couple of years, that's going to result in records that are in better condition, are going to be more authentic, and will remain accessible for a longer period of time. So preservation is something that can extend into the past as well. So there's constantly someone looking at records and interacting with records, and it's good to make sure that those interactions and the environment that records are in or is in is one that supports the future preservation of records that archivists may be interested in acquiring. It's also interesting to connect preservation to appraisal, and that's something that the O'Toole article touches on. So as an archive takes care of records, and as they're considering and reconsidering the value of records, which may kind of ebb and flow over time, as O'Toole notes, that may lead archives to reconsider the level of care that a record or a collection is receiving. So a collection may seem very unimportant when it comes in, and so an archivist may be like, okay, we can only take care of so many collections. This one doesn't seem important, so we're not going to worry about this one as much. It may be that a collection comes in and it's not thought of as being very important, but as researchers interact with it and as archivists become more aware of the value of a collection, that may lead them to taking better care of the collection and having stricter standards for what the permanence of those records and of that collection will look like. And it can be difficult to know the importance of records if you aren't interacting with researchers before the records end up in archives. So again, it just goes back to the idea of the appraisal of records as not being something that exists once and then it stops. It's a process that constantly continues within archives and before archives, and it is something that archives should consider when assigning particular expectations or values of permanence to the records in their care. The O'Toole article focuses on some of the implications of new ideas of permanence, or ideas that do say we aren't really responsible for preserving records in their original format, and sometimes the informational content of a record is perfectly fine, in case in a vast majority of instances this is true. So O'Toole sees this as kind of a challenge to archival identity and archival orthodoxy. So he really questions what choices archivists have to make when they're thinking about permanence. He wonders, what can having a more flexible attitude about permanence allow archivists to do? Well, it really can allow archivists to take resources that were being wasted on preserving records in a way that doesn't match their value, and using those resources on something else, such as processing more collections or providing more efficient and responsive researcher services. It's important to think about what concerns might donors have. If you have a donor who wants to donate materials to your archive and you say, well, we're going to take care of this, but not too well, then that may turn some researchers off and make them think, okay, well, if you're not going to take care of my stuff, then I'm not going to give it to you, which would be understandable. So it's certainly important to be upfront with donors about the level of permanence that their materials are going to receive, and just being transparent about that. And I guess more existentially, what do changing ideas about permanence say about archives and why they exist? If archives don't exist to preserve records to the highest standard, then what does that say about archives and the value that archives have in society? So thinking about permanence in a different, maybe more evolved way really can challenge some of the long-running assumptions that archivists and donors alike have about archives and about the care that records that are in archives receive. And those are important thoughts and conversations to have. So we'll close by looking at some of the different types of curatorship that we can associate with preservation. So for example, looking at creation by the individual traditionally named as the donor. As I talked about before, if donors keep records in an environment that is very poor and is not conducive to preservation, that can result in those records being damaged and information contained in those records being lost because of the damages that those records endure. And that can really impact how researchers perceive and interact with records in the future. When we're looking at creation by communities to which creators belong, different cultures might have different ideas about which materials should be preserved and how those materials be preserved. And that can be something that can impact how archives preserve materials and the information that researchers have to work with when they interact with records. You're looking at custodians, oftentimes it may not be the person that created the record that is tasked with preserving the record or creates the conditions that records are preserved in. So someone's family may take, a person's diary or personal papers, and whatever decisions they make about how those records are kept are going to impact the information contained within records and the overall quality of records that researchers are going to have to work with in the future. Looking at creation by archivists, as we've talked about, preservation can be a process that is loaded with all kinds of value judgments by archivists about which collections are going to be prioritized for preservation, which collections are going to be the ones that are really well taken care of, and which collections are going to be ones that archives aren't really going to be as concerned with preserving for the future. So again, that can extend to preservation planning, to emergency planning, to decisions that archivists make about the permanence of records and how they sort of interpret and assign that. And that can really impact the information that researchers have to work with in the future. Creation by activators maybe isn't as influential when it comes to preservation. If researchers work with records and that makes archives more aware of the value of records, and that may lead an archive to putting more resources into preserving a collection than they had before. So that may be a way that this type of creation can impact preservation. Probably not as influential as the other types of curatorship that we can discuss in relation to preservation, but possibly an important influence as well. Okay, so we'll stop there. I hope you enjoyed learning more about preservation. It is more than just putting something in a climate-controlled room. It is more than you should keep X record in X temperature range and within X level of humidity. It does involve interventions by archivists. It does involve archivists rethinking their responsibility to records and to researchers in the future. It does involve archivists making a lot of value judgments about records, and it does involve those value judgments corresponding with decisions made about archivists about how records are going to be cared for. And again, this can have a lot of impact on social memory, because if an archivist decides that they don't need to preserve the original format of a record, then the information contained in that original format may be lost forever. And that's something that archivists have to keep in the back of their minds when they are making decisions about permanence and the responsibility that they have to their researchers and to donors as well. So thank you for listening. Have a great week, and as always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. So stay safe out there, and I will talk to you again soon.